Welcome to another episode of Lead by Design. I am your host, Elle Edwards, founder of Yuya and the Blue House, and I'm delighted that you're here. Whether this is your first episode or if you've been here for the entire season, welcome. I'm excited to share today's guest with you. Don't forget, the Lead by Design podcast is here to share lots of different stories from lots of different leaders all over the world. Genesis 1:26 is your leadership mandate. If you are human, you are a leader. And so we're bringing lots of different stories from lots of different leaders in the hopes that you will recognize yourself and be able to put yourself in some of those stories. Maybe you're not sure if you're even a leader. Hopefully, as a result of these stories, you'll go, yes, I am a leader, because you are. Assuming you are human, of course. And so today I am delighted to share our guest, Paul Granger. Paul and I met when I was a guest on his podcast, and I'm delighted to finally have him here as a guest on my podcast. I can't wait for you to hear Paul's story, the adventures and the journey that he's been on with God. With all of that said, let's get cracking with today's episode. How would you describe the adventure like right now today? Give us some context for what life looks like at the moment.
Yeah. So I was just talking to a spiritual father of mine about it yesterday. This has been the case every one of those past 5 years. I cannot project out what 6 months from now will look like or what a year will look like. But I feel like this year is different because I have the sense that God's about to do something different. And what's funny is my life has been going in these 5-year periods. I worked at one ministry for around 5 years, and then there was a shift, and then the other one, and I lost my job. And now I'm at the 5-year mark, and I was like, is this a thing that God's doing now every 5 years? But one of the biggest things right now is I'm about to post the finale episode of the season that I've been doing on the podcast, where it's focused on sitting and suffering, which is not what you would call an out the box, exciting, encouraging topic to focus on for a whole series. And that's the conversation I had with God when he prompted the idea, because when it came about, I was finishing up the healing series, and that's where you and I met.
Yeah.
And that ended up being 51 episodes.
Wow.
And that was not my plan. I told God, I'm game to do like 1 or 2 episodes on healing, but like, it's a tricky topic. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time. God's like, are you sure? And 51 episodes later, I'm like, God, I'm really grateful for this experience. It was good. I need to take a break. And God's like, are you sure? And he prompted this idea of doing a series focused on sitting and suffering.
Right.
And here I am 52 episodes later. And it's been interesting because it's a topic we don't talk about.
Yeah.
We are not comfortable as people, but as Christians, even more uncomfortable talking about this idea of suffering. But I've been able to sit with folks who have gone through some horrendous things, who are going through horrendous things, and yet somehow able to say that God is still God and God is still good. And so now I'm at the tail end of that, and I'm like, all right, God, what's next? And I think part of it might be some writing, part of it might be some other thing. I don't know. But that's the thing, is like, I don't have to know. That's the thing I'm getting more and more peace around, is if I don't need to know what's ahead, as long as I know that God is ahead. And I can step forward towards question marks if I know that God is also in the midst of those question marks. So what does the things look like now? A whole lot of question marks, but also a whole lot of God. He's been showing up in some beautiful, beautiful ways. And I have a peace that he is at work, even if I don't find out what he was doing until I'm face to face.
Yeah. And you do all of that whilst obviously, you've got a family. It's not like you're just a single guy who can go and sleep on someone's sofa if you want to. That must have brought its own challenges, because the stereotypical is, I'm the man of the house, I'm going to provide for my family. How did you deal with that?
I kind of was forced to, right? Because losing your job, suddenly you have to contend with all of those assumptions of how things should be. The man should be the breadwinner and this, that, and the other. Well, if I'm unemployed, I mean, I haven't brought in a traditional paycheck in nearly 5 years. And unfortunately, God had already been working on me to give me a piece of knowing who he is and knowing who I am, and not letting either of those things be determined by what other people assume or what other people think. And so I was able to walk through that. But I think the next hard season was when my wife felt like God was calling her to go back into full-time teaching. Right. That's a hard job. But on top of that, it is a demanding job in terms of time. Like, she has to be at work. It's actually, for some people, they get sick, they call out sick. It's as easy as that. For a teacher, you get sick, before you call out sick, you got to create a whole new set of plans for the substitute to use, and you've got to, so you actually have to do a lot of work in order to not work when you're sick.
Yeah.
So what that means for me is I need to be ready to be on call, the on-call parent at any given point. So I'm functionally trying to, loosely put the 40 hours in a week. It does not look at all like a normal work week, but a kid could get sick and it throws my plans off. My youngest is in preschool only 3 mornings a week. So the rest of the time he could be with me. He could be literally crawling on me. If he wasn't being taken to preschool right now by his grandma, he'd probably be banging on the door. And so, we feel like in order to do good work, we need to have focused, quiet space. But anybody with young kids knows that's a myth. Is that a thing that really exists? And if you're still holding on to the perfect environment, then you'll get stifled. And so I've had to learn to trust that God can still work even with the interruptions. But even more than that is I need to learn that whatever I think the ministry is, I might actually be mistaken, because the real ministry might be sitting with my youngest, might be pouring into my kids, might be serving my wife by being the on-call parent. And this is the big trap, those who do ministry or missions can get caught up into, is they think the external projects are the thing. But sometimes God's like, what if I don't want you to do a single thing for a year other than love your spouse or care for your kids or take a whole bunch of hits, because that's protecting others. It's like, are we willing to trust God's plans for ministry for us if it means costing us our own plans? And when we get to that place where we are, then like we can get to where I'm grateful that God's brought me as a piece of not knowing, but still knowing that God's working.
Yeah, that's so good. And I would maintain it's not even just little kids. I mean, like I said to you before we started, my baby was 16 this week, and I still find, because I'm the one, we made a decision as a young couple when the kids were small that they'd always have me at home. And so I've never worked full time since we've been married. But, similar to what you're describing, really, you have all these plans and you make all these decisions, and then suddenly one of them is sick, or even something as simple as they forget their PE kit, or just it's the school holidays, or just what feels like random inane nonsense. And so and I think sometimes it depends on the way our minds are wired. Some of us struggle with the focus piece anyway. So I love that reminder that you're actually carving out this way of doing life and finding peace in it, regardless of what's going on, and not in a way where you're like just shutting yourself away and abandoning the world. Because one of the pieces is I often find what you're describing is more of the role that women stereotypically take. And so you see, I see these men in particular have these great big platforms, and they do all this, they're off to this place speaking and that place. I'm like, yeah, that's great, but because you've got the support of an amazing wife who's running your family, and it can be frustrating, but it's ultimately illusion, isn't it? You can't do everything and have everything. It's just wow, that's just so encouraging. So how do you feel like? I want to go back slightly. Okay, for my first question actually, but when you lost your job, what was the job that you were doing and you lost your job unexpectedly?
Yeah. So it was a local nonprofit ministry, and I actually had 3 roles really. It was I ran the internships and year-long residencies. I ran service groups and service projects, service teams, including like in the summers we would have a lot come in, and I did all the videography. So what was funny is the most intense points of each of those jobs ended up falling at the exact same period of time in the spring, which was pretty awful. If they were spread out, it could be more manageable. But and the ministry itself does a lot with serving youth in the community. The community that I live in has had generations of hardships thrust upon it. There's a lot of history that's created that. But we have a high level of poverty, of evictions.
We should ask, where in the world are you? Obviously, you're in the US.
People are like, where is this guy? Trying to figure out his accent. I am in Richmond, Virginia, in the United States. Yeah.
Is that kind of in the middle? Give me the British.
It's East Coast. DC, we're just a couple hours south of DC. Gotcha. So most people know about where DC is. We're right south of that. Yeah. And so my community just has a lot of struggles. Addictions, gun violence. We've had a murder within literally I could throw a stone to where there's a body in the street at least once a year. So these hardships are things that it's one thing for me to feel like God's called me here and to serve in that space. But there's a lot of kids that didn't choose to be here. They were born, and this is their home, and they're now having to navigate what is life. And for one of the hard things is, if all you ever know is a certain thing, then that is life to you. And
true.
so for a lot of the kids, they are only knowing a life where you have limited resources, you have insufficient housing, you have gunshots, you have family members dying, you have family members wrestling with alcohol or drugs, and then you're seeing this other world where people are painting this picture of a thriving life, of big homes, of fancy cars, of all these things. And
the American dream.
Right. And it's like, what do I do with this disparity? And what can happen is a kid or even adult can start to think that they're the problem. Well, I must be lesser. I must not be good enough because I tried and tried and tried and it didn't get anywhere. So maybe I'm the problem. Or you can say I'm not the problem, but like everyone else is still blockading me. And now what do I do? And you keep hitting these walls. And so one of the things that this ministry was seeking to do was meet kids from like preschool all the way up to high school and even into the young adult stage, and say, how can we come alongside and address some of these barriers? So there's no jobs for teens in the community. All right, let's create some jobs and job training program. Oh, the schools are limited in resources. Well, let's create some additional options for school that kids can go to. Oh, they need help with their homework, but their mom's working 3 jobs just to get food on the table. Well, let's create an after school program so that the kids can be poured into and invested in. All along the way, there's relationship. All along the way, there's demonstrate being ambassadors of Christ to say, hey, this is what we believe about life and how we see God working. And we know God loves you. So what could that look like in your life? And and a myriad of things, you know.
Wow. So you talked about the fact that you felt called to where you're living now. So where were you living originally?
Where was I before? Yeah. So I grew up in the country.
Okay.
So I was on 10 acres in the woods and never planned to live in the city. Never had a desire. I'm an introvert. So like the idea of being around busyness and noise and lots of people is not like my thing. I would much rather have a porch with a view. And but when I was in high school is when I really started to press into, well, what is it? I've always been a Christian, but what does it mean for me to know what that means for me? What does it mean for me to have a personal relationship with God, personal interaction with God? And very quickly, like how I understood life shifted. And I just had this clear sense, I want to serve God with my life. I want to do ministry. I didn't know what that meant, right? Like the only context I had is that means you're either a pastor or you're a missionary in some country nobody's ever been in, right? It's like, these are the only concepts I had. And so it's been beautiful to see how God's fleshed that out. I never planned to go to the city, but there is a point when I was about to graduate that I'm like, oh, I should figure out what I should do. And my friend and I, we began praying about this, and we kept coming back with the same sense. The first was, we didn't feel like God was calling us overseas. All right, so we're in the States. We felt like God was saying he wanted us to go into an urban context. Neither of us grew up in one. We're like, all right, well, let's do it. And we felt like God was calling us to serve youth. And so we're like, I guess we're doing urban youth ministry. Never done it before, but all right, let's jump in. And then God opened doors for connections and opportunities. I was with Urban Promise Wilmington in Wilmington, Delaware, an amazing organization. I think they're around the world now, but that solidified just some spiritual core things, my understanding of how to love neighbors, how to serve as community. And then God said it was time to go to Richmond. And I was like, all right. And I've just been listening ever since for whatever the next invitation is.
Wow. And that's where you met your wife?
I met my wife, ironically, at the ministry in Wilmington, Delaware, which again, neither of us were from Wilmington. Neither of us had ever probably heard of Wilmington, but she came up to do a spring break week. And I was finishing out my couple years there. And we met there, and then both of us ended up back in Virginia. And when I moved to Richmond, we were about to get engaged, and so she was looking for a teaching job. She's like, I guess I should look in Richmond since we're getting serious. And so that brought her to Richmond, which was not her plan, but here we are.
Wow, I love that. So it's interesting because you said I've always been a Christian. So did you grow up in a Christian family? And did you ever have a
Yeah.
moment where you like prayed the prayer, or was it just because most people have that moment, even though I'm like,
Mhm.
yeah, it's a journey, but it sounds
Yeah,
like you
yeah, yeah.
almost didn't. So what was that
Yeah.
process for you?
And that was a hard thing for me for a long time, because you get this idea that testimony is that you need to
Mm,
know the day and you need to have this bad life and suddenly you have a good life. And
mm,
my story was, I just kind of always went to church and always knew God. And it was a
yeah.
very casual, gradual thing, like no specific day, no specific prayer. And so I
Wow.
felt like something might be wrong with me or I didn't do it right for a long time. And so God was like, no, it's like you said, it's a
Mm,
journey. Like, do you
yeah.
know me? Okay, so we're good.
Yeah.
My mom has always been a strong believer.
Mm.
My father is, from what I understand, was he passed away when I was 5. He was
Oh wow.
36 years old, had a heart attack,
Oh goodness.
really unexpected thing. But my mom said he would run Sunday school. And so,
Yeah.
there was that core foundation. But what I remember is my mom,
Mm.
and just how, not just how much she did overtly, like taking us to church, which there were points when I was a kid that I didn't appreciate
Yeah.
it, right?
Of course.
And we went to a tiny Presbyterian church where there was like 20 of us on a good day. The
Right.
youth group sometimes was just my brother and I, like a really
Mm.
tiny thing. So as a kid, I'm like, oh, this is boring.
Yeah.
Um, but my mom was faithful and consistent, and she also demonstrated she was an ambassador of Christ.
Yeah.
She lived out what she believed. It wasn't just I'm a Christian, so I'm supposed to do this. She actually believes what she believes, and it influences her life and how she interacts with and loves others.
Yes.
So, but there was a point in middle and high school where that's when I started to say, I don't think it's enough that I just go to church and say I'm a Christian. I
Yeah.
think it should probably mean something for me.
Wow.
So somewhere around in there, don't know the day, but I
No.
know the period of life.
Yeah. This makes you feel any better. I say I prayed the prayer when I was 12 or 13. I haven't got a date
Yeah.
either. So
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I think for those of us who sort of grew up in church, it can be a bit sort of more
Yeah.
fudgy around the dates and the rest of it. So what I love about your story is effectively, and what I'm hearing, paraphrasing, is that you came to this point and you're like, okay, God, let's do this. And ever
Hmm.
since then, you've been journeying with God,
Yeah.
and you're in ministry. But like you say, it's not this traditional, like, you correct me if I'm wrong, you like a theology degree, or I'm a
Right.
pastor, or any of these things. You're
Yeah.
actually living this life. You're an ambassador for Christ.
Yeah.
It's just brilliant. I love it.
Yeah.
I think it's really encouraging for people who are listening along, going, yeah, I love Jesus and I'm not a minister, but I want to do life with
Yeah.
God. It shows them that it's possible. It's
Yeah. Well, and it's so important for us to know this, because we unfortunately have cast different expectations that in order to be really valuable for the kingdom, you need to be doing overt kingdom work,
yeah.
whatever that is in our minds. But the truth is that God does call people to some very overt forms of ministry. And God also calls some people to be ambassador of Christ in very secular spaces.
Yeah, definitely.
And the big question comes down to, how are we defining spiritual success? That's been a
Mm,
big topic in my mind for a long time. And unfortunately, the way we typically define it is, how many people did I save? Or how many lives did I
as if we did
fix?
the
Or
saving.
right, exactly. And what it also does is it then implies that the only valuable thing is if somebody gets to this specific place. So let's talk about addiction, for example.
Mm,
For a lot of people, spiritual success is that that person loses the taste for cocaine and never
mm,
touches it again, right? And they break
yeah,
their addiction, and now they're free, and now they have a thriving life. And not only do they have a job, but they're going and speaking and all the, like, that's success. What is
mm,
unsuccessful is if that person goes the rest of their life and still relapses and relapses and relapses.
mm,
But the question is that how God looks at that person?
yeah,
Because the truth about addiction is it is not something you could just kick and you're done with. It is, there are actual things going on in your brain that can
mm,
impact your thinking. And it's
mm,
something that you carry for the rest of your life. And you can have tips and tricks, and you can have accountability. You can have all these things that you put in place to
mm,
help you navigate through. But that addiction is still shouting at you in
yeah,
the background. And so if we're seeing spiritual success in somebody's life only as they're fixed,
mm,
then a lot of people are going to go unloved
yeah,
that might really need love in that moment. And so
mm,
there's a few relationships I have with neighbors who, some of them are unsheltered, some of them have been wrestling with addiction for a while, and there have been moments where I've had to confront that, like what I desired to see in their life, or I opened an opportunity and they didn't take it, or this, that, and the other.
mm,
And then meanwhile, God would just whisper very quietly, I didn't tell you to fix them. I didn't tell you to figure out their situation. I invited you to be an ambassador of Christ and love them. So just just love them. Let me worry about the rest, right?
Mm.
It's like the judge not peace. That's part of why that's there.
Yeah.
God's the one that can look and determine where somebody should be or should not be. Our job is simply to love. And so this is the good news for every single person that's listening, whether you're in an overt ministry or you're in a job that seems to have no spiritual value at all. Like you're still an ambassador of Christ.
Yeah.
And your call is to love in that space, whoever God brings across your path. And for me, spiritual success really ultimately has nothing to do with what we will see in this lifetime.
Yeah.
It's that moment where we get to hear God say, well done, my good and faithful servant. Because one of the things that I felt like God was talking to me about with my podcast is I've had this sense from the start that it's not about numbers, that it's not about acclaim, that it's not about being the next big thing. And God's like, what if I had you invest years of your life in this and not a single person ever listened, right? Or what if like at the end of your life, everybody looked and not only saw no value in the work that you did, but actually said you probably did the opposite. You probably, took away value where you could have poured in more, and they saw you as unsuccessful. But then you got to me and I said, well done, my good and faithful servant. That decades of investment, it produced this thing that I needed it to produce. And you didn't get to see it then, but I saw it. Would you be okay with that invitation? Would we be okay with a life that looks foolish and unsuccessful to others? That's what Jesus signed on for. Because when he was on the cross, a lot of people looked at him and said, that guy's foolish. That guy's, he could have been the next big thing, but look, he's just being killed. But he knew it wasn't about how people perceived him or what value they saw. It's about what he knew his father was asking him to do. And was he willing to do it? And fortunately for us, he was.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow. Yeah. And I'm reminded as well is like, so sometimes, like you say, we just love people. There's been a phrase that's come up a few times over the last few months, like letting go of the outcome. We're not always going to see the fruit, are we? We just simply sow the seeds and show up and love, and then let God, like you say, handle the rest of it. Yeah. So it's just such an important reminder. And you're right. We tend to sort of, we as in you and I, but Christians as a whole, like we like to keep score, don't we? And I don't think God keeps score at all, and certainly not in the way that we keep score. It's such an important reminder. I love that. So one of the pieces I sometimes often, like, we don't have any set questions, but one of the questions that comes up quite a lot then is, how do you talk about from the context of, all humans are leaders? How do you as a leader look after yourself, put on your own life jacket first, recognizing that, you're part of a lovely, young, busy family. So how do you take care of yourself and make sure that you don't, I don't know, burn out or...
Yeah. Two things come to mind. So one, I learned in a season of burnout. So the ministry that I was in was before I lost the job, which I lost without cause. There was never a reason given. It was a very horrendous environment. It was a very painful environment. Much longer story than we'll get into now. But part of what the pain came from was I was internalizing a lot of what was being said about me, or a lot of what was being assumed about me. A lot of basically lies about my identity were just floating around. The enemy was throwing some stuff out there, and I was internalizing that and believing it, not actually trusting who God made me to be, because I knew people were telling me, Paul, why don't you just quit? Why don't you leave that space? And the reason I didn't is because I wanted to, and I felt like God invited me to stay. He didn't force me to stay. He didn't tell me to stay. I felt like he was inviting me to stay and telling me that it wouldn't get any easier. It would get harder.
Right.
And so I had this sense that God was giving me a hard invitation, and I had a willingness, not necessarily the strength, but the willingness to say, okay. And then more things would happen, and I would start to question, did I really hear from God? Do I even deserve God? And one of the healing things for me was actually getting to a place where I learned and held to who God is, that he is powerful and loving, and who he's created me to be. And even if no one else sees the value, if I know that's who God's invited me to be, then I can choose to be confident in that. In other words, I could choose to find peace regardless of the circumstances, regardless of what other people communicate. And that was the first really freeing thing for me. The second thing was, oftentimes our approach to burnout is, if something is hard, then stop doing the hard thing. And that can be true. That can be true. But what about those times where God's inviting us into a hard space that's not going to get easier? You can look throughout scripture and find people who were in invited into seasons that could cause a lot of burnout, maybe did cause a lot of burnout. But because of the calling they sensed from God, they knew leaving it wasn't the answer. And so in some of these relationships that I mentioned earlier with friends who wrestle with addiction and homelessness, I had these moments where I even last year was like, just felt weary. Weary was the word. I didn't have that word in my mind. It came later when somebody gave me the verse for a different reason. Do not grow weary in doing good. And I realized that's what I'm feeling because I'm trying to do the good that God's invited me to. And I keep hitting walls, or they keep like rejecting this like way out, or this, that, or the other, or they're asking too much for me, or I need help. Why isn't someone, like, I'm weary. And I feel like what God taught me in that moment is we can get to the end of ourselves. But if we're in a place that God never told us to go, then yeah, maybe leaving that is the answer. But if we're at a place that we feel like God's invited us to be, are we willing to trust that God could be our strength? Like the Apostle Paul says when he asked for the thorn to be removed, in my weakness, he is shown strong. We get burned out when we're trying to muster the strength within ourselves instead of saying, you know what, God, I need to be honest with you. I'm at the end of myself, but I believe that you could be my strength. So I need you. Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane had no strength left, but what he did have is the willingness to say, but not my will, but yours be done. And he was able to endure the hardest thing anyone has or ever will endure, because God can provide that strength. And so that's something I've had to come back to over and over and over, because it's not just enough to have intellectual knowledge of it, because then you get into that new situation or that old situation that keeps coming up and you start to question what you know. And so sometimes it's about still choosing to step forward. God could save me from this fiery furnace, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego say it. But even if he doesn't, we're going to step forward. Am I willing to keep stepping towards God, not towards comfort, peace, accomplishments? And if I do that, then God has been faithful. I can look back and say, yes, in every single situation, I've never been defeated. I am still here. We're talking now because God was faithful to get me through.
Yeah, that's so good. Yes, what I hear in that as well is it's just the importance of identity and knowing, knowing who God is. Like I say, He is love. God is good. He is love. But also knowing who you are. That's just so important. And how God sees you, as opposed to how you might even see yourself on a bad day. That identity piece is so powerful. And I feel nudged just to encourage anybody who's sort of following along who struggles with that. I would encourage you to take that to God and ask Him how He sees you, because it is a game changer. I mean, like, because we talked about it before, probably when I was on your podcast, when I was not being me, when I wasn't being you, I remember being very angry and like just you wouldn't recognize me even though I looked the same. Because stepping into who God made me to be and who He says I am was just like night and day. I can't overemphasize just how important it is. And like, I'm talking more than I normally do on this podcast, but it just feels really important. Normally it's all about our guests, but it's part of my calling really, is about, is that identity piece. It feels really important. I love that so much. So if you could go back and, okay, no, 2 questions. First question, sorry, not sorry. Are there any pieces that, as you reflect back on your journey thus far, that were unexpected, or that you go, that wasn't what I saw coming? However, how have you navigated that piece? Because I suspect the answer normally is, there's always unexpected pieces. But is there anything particular that comes to mind around that?
Yeah. I mean, I think the whole thing is just littered with those moments, because the truth is like, we want to understand, we want to figure things out. We want to plan things out, and we want to feel like we're the hero of it. And so actually, I'll even say, you apologize for talking too much, but no, like the focus isn't actually on me, right? Because if it is, then somebody could look at me and say, oh, wow, Paul is such an amazing Christian. I wish I could be like Paul. No, like I'm just kind of figuring this out, stumbling along. And the real power is in us talking, is in this community, because we have our different experiences. We've had the different things we learned. Sometimes it's the same thing we learned that we're now affirming, but we're coming alongside each other. And that's one of the things that I've seen throughout the journey, is how often it's not about me or me figuring it out or what God did through me, but it is about, am I willing to be an ambassador, because it's about Christ and how often He has shown up, and it's not because of me. The Apostle Paul, is dealing with some folks who are arguing about who's better, Paul or Apollos. And He's like, who's Paul? Who's Apollos? Like, I plant the seed, Apollos waters it, but God makes it grow. Paul's basically saying that the work he's doing, he knows will produce fruit, but he may never see that fruit. He might not get credit for the fruit. He might actually get passed over and said, oh, Paul, who's that? Apollos is the one who really did it. Forget whatever Paul says he did, right? And so I have all these moments, right, throughout my journey where I had an idea of how it should go, and then it doesn't go that way. And I'm like, God, this seems like the better way. And I'm not, why aren't you doing this? Or I thought you were promising this to me. And so, I mean, I've got stories and stories and stories of these moments where it was really beautiful to see how later on I could look back and recognize God's wisdom in not doing it the way I said, or God's wisdom in doing something different, or to not get that clarification, right? But being able to say, but even so, God is good. Because the truth is God's actually trying to accomplish far exceedingly more than we could ask or imagine. So whatever we're asking for, whatever we're imagining, God's like, that's cute, but I want to do something bigger than that. And not just bigger than that, but bigger than you, because you are a part of a body. This conversation isn't about you, Paul. It's about you and Elle, and it's about whoever's listening. And you two may never know what seed I plant through your willingness to talk and let the Spirit lead. But that seed may sprout and someone else may water it. And then you may get to eternity and I show you what I did with those little steps of obedience. And so I think I would say that's the big thing, is I know that my life is also filled with moments that I haven't gotten to see the fruit of, and I may never see the fruit of. But can I be so confident in God's power and goodness that I'm able to say, it is well, that is fine if I don't know, because God knows.
Yeah, that's so good. It comes back to the outcomes piece, doesn't it? I have this picture sometimes in my mind of like the welcoming committee, and there'll be these people come ring up to you, say, hey, Paul, did you? And you're like, I don't know who you are. Like, but it blows my mind. It's phenomenal. It's just, so if you could go back to that high school kid in high school, when you're like, okay, I want to do so much more than just be a Christian and go to church on a Sunday, with the benefit of the journey you've been on so far, assuming that this maybe slightly rambunctious teenager would, speaking out for myself, I wouldn't have listened to myself as a teenager, but maybe you were you're an introvert, maybe you're more obedient than me. What would you tell your teenage self if you could go back and tell him anything?
It's funny because we would want to convey all the wisdom we've learned, but we only learned the wisdom because we learned it through trial. We learned it through hardship.
So
we learned it through continuing to not learn it, right? And having to relearn it. So I'm painfully aware that there's a lot that I couldn't actually effectively communicate. I mean, how much have you and I communicated to our kids that then they don't grasp, but we're like, this is so simple, this would benefit you so much. So what we learn as parents is that ultimately, like, yes, we still convey this information, but what we are actually conveying more than that is consistent love, sacrificial love, right? And so I think that's what I would want to convey to myself, is God is love. And so I would want to convey that piece, like, ask God to show you what that means. What is love actually? Because that was a question that I stumbled on in a moment of like feeling disconnected from God my senior year of college. And I had this revelation that what I didn't understand about God is the whole love piece. And so I prayed that God would show me that. And 2 years later that was part of why God brought my wife and I together, is that I knew clearly that was God saying, here's where you're going to get the answer to that. And it's not going to be a quick one, because it's the journey of learning how to love your spouse and then love your kids. It's a lifelong journey that you don't stop learning it, because you discover how much deeper love is. Like, you could think you really love your kids, and then they get in a horrendous accident, almost lose their life. And suddenly your understanding of how much you love them, you discover a new piece of it, a hard piece of it. Or they do something amazing. Like they finally learn to tie their shoes, or they become valedictorian. And suddenly there's this element of love that you have for them that is new and deeper. So that's what I would say, is God is love. God's not accomplishments. God's not this, that, or the other. God's not a lot of what we assume he is. He's actually abundantly more. And so ask God to show you what love is, and then go about your life. And I'm not going to give you spoilers, Paul. You're just going to have to go through it like I did. But that's part of it. Because again, like you noted, it's a journey. If it was just about giving the answers, it's like playing a video game and I have the cheat code to get to the last level. Well, then what's the point of playing the game? If it's just about winning, then it's done. But if it's about playing the game, if it's about just having fun playing chess instead of, it's like, then suddenly we discover a value in the moment.
Yeah.
Rather than just a value if we get to the destination.
Yeah, and I think that's so important, isn't it? It's like God does have this plan and purpose for your life, but he's as interested, or I would argue probably more interested in actually how you journey with him, as opposed to whether you get to that point. That's just so beautiful. And it occurred to me as well, even like not just with our kids, but but our spouses as well. You sort of do this whole love thing, and then they sort of like change slightly, because if they're kids, they grow up and they become, and then you're like, okay, you love them in a whole other way as well. It's but then this thought pops in my mind, is that's like how God loves us. Like he always loves us, and he doesn't change. But as we grow and change, and my brain's going ding, 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 ding now. Yeah, okay. Yeah. Whole other, but that love piece, and just the foundation of God is love, is just so important. I love that we've talked about love. It's just so good. We are over time. There's so much more we could talk about. I've said this to many guests, but we'll have to have you back for season 2 or season 3. Yeah. Because we can talk more. There's so much other directions we could go in. But I wonder if you would. Oh, 2 things. Okay, thank you, Holy Spirit. You said that you don't know what the next 6 months looks like. Have you got any like hints or? It's that question. Okay. What do you do with the uncertainty? How do you, like, I don't know if you're a list maker or somebody, I'm a recovering certainty freak. So how do you deal with that uncertainty is my actual question.
Yeah. I think one thing that makes it easy doing full-time ministry is that there's a lot more flexibility of what has to happen or what can happen. And so that also makes it harder, right? Because then it's like, it makes more room for unknown. Should I do this? Should I do that? But the question that allows me to ask, which anybody can ask this, is, this is what I think I want to do. This is what it looks like I should do. But where do I sense that God might be? And am I willing to take a step towards that? Now, that doesn't mean God tell me exactly what to do. It doesn't mean that thing is where God is, but sometimes it's less about the thing and more about, well, I want to do this because it'll be more comfortable, but this is going to push me to trust God more. And that might be. So I think that's what I do with the uncertainty, is I just ask that question. All right, where do I sense that God is? And can I step towards that and release, again, how this might make me look, or how other people might feel, or do I accomplish what I want to accomplish, or do I get what I'm longing to get? Like, is God enough for me that if I step in this and I don't get any of the things? And so I think it's an ongoing decision to do that. And then sometimes it's just a simple prayer: God, order my steps. And then I just step forward, however it feels, right? And then believe that God could do that, because if he wanted to stop me, he can. So if he doesn't, then I'm probably fine.
Yeah, that's so good and so practical for people as well. So so I would encourage anybody who's sort of like struggles with that, go back and listen to that last piece, those keys that Paul gave you, because they're really powerful. Would you, to finish, we're going to have links in the show notes to your website and all those good things. So I'm not going to ask you to repeat them because they'll be in the show notes. What I would ask you to do, if you would be so kind, is would you release a prayer over our audience as we close out, please?
Father God, I just thank you that you are God and you are good, and that reality is true for every single person that's hearing these words. That you are powerful in their lives, and you love them deeply, more deeply than they know, more deeply than they trust, more deeply than they believe. That your love is abundantly more than we could ask or imagine. And so I thank you that you love each person. And I pray that right now there may be something that is keeping them from trusting that, keeping them from seeking that. So I pray that there just be this little pinprick of light, that you would pull their eyes to that, because I love what's so powerful about light is it could be the smallest light ever, but if it's complete darkness, suddenly that light could illuminate everything as our eyes adjust. And so I pray for the adjusting of eyes, that you would give eyes to see and that they would begin to see that you very much are present and active and working and loving in their situation, in their jobs, in their relationships, that nothing goes outside of your ability and power and love. And that you're inviting them not to have a fixed situation, but to be your child. That the true gift right now is that even if everything gets worse, there can be unimaginable peace and joy in simply knowing the reality that we are your children. And so I pray for that right now, that even in the hardest of moments, that they would feel your closeness and love. They would know that that will never change. his famous, holy, and precious name. Amen.
Thank you again for joining us for today's episode of the podcast. I do hope it's been a blessing and an encouragement, and maybe even a challenge to you in the best way possible. Don't forget, links are in the show notes where you can follow along, enjoy Paul's podcast and get involved with the ministry and everything that he's doing. And if you know somebody who would benefit from Paul's story, please do share this episode with them, and do so with a great big thank you from me. And finally, if you are someone who is looking for some support and some encouragement and some community as you journey and as you walk out your God adventure, we've got you covered inside the Blue House. uia.com/join is where you can find out more and join us, and links for that will be in the show notes as well. With all of that said, I am delighted that you are here. I look forward to sharing the next episode with you very, very soon. Don't forget, remember, if you haven't already subscribed, please do subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. I look forward to catching up with you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.